Welcome to the Mindshift podcast. Today is episode 5. I have a wonderful guest today, Britt Hartley. She goes by No Nonsense Spirituality Online. She has a wonderful book by that same title, tons of online resources. She did a video that caught my attention that was 10 things that die with the death of God. These 10 things are really important to consider. And I think we both share a similar goal of helping people as they move from religion into what Britt calls the void. I'm thinking that Britt can give us some really good advice as we go through this. So without further ado, welcome to the channel, Britt Hartley.
My pleasure.
Really excited to have you here today. This video, you're brand new on YouTube at least, correct? It's only been like a month?
Yeah, just stepped my toe into YouTube, so we'll see how that goes.
Your content's fantastic, and I would again just encourage anyone, I'll link it down below. Please go and check out Britt's channel. I think you'll really like what she's doing. If you like what I'm doing, I'm certain of it. So tell us a little bit more about your background. What religion were you in? When did you leave? What caused you to leave? And then let's get into your academic background, and then we'll dive into your video.
Yeah, so I kind of have a long deconstruction journey and a long reconstruction journey as part of my story. I was raised Mormon. I lost faith in that religion by the time I was a teenager, was kicked out of my home for various poor decisions by the time I was 16. And I would say by then I was doing what you would probably call nuanced Christianity. I don't know if I had that term yet. I was really driven by this question of what is. You know, if I could just figure out what the hell is going on here, I could try to pattern my life accordingly. So I'm really driven by these metaphysical questions, even when I was younger. So then I spent some time in Christianity. I ended up getting my master's degree in theology. I have an almost doctorate now in theology. And like so many people, I lost my faith in not only Christianity, but also God while in theology school, which is actually not that uncommon. For some people, they leave religion and they just kind of take off flying and like, this is great, everything's great, it's going to be fine. I, perhaps because I tend towards the neurotic scale, I did not immediately do great upon the death of God. I kept deconstructing not only religion and God, but then sense of self and free will and morality. I'm just deconstructing everything. And the end of that road, the end of deconstruction is the void, which is you have no more anchors left. You have no more psychological or social anchors left. You've just blown everything up. And I was in need of tools for this space. I was not thriving. I was not doing well. I had some, what you would probably call now existential crisis or existential depression, and continued to study and learn and grow and gather tools for rebuilding, this time without belief and this time without faith in the supernatural that I couldn't do anymore. And so now I really advocate for secular spirituality. And so, you know, my platforms online are No Nonsense Spirituality, which is how do we get tools that are good for us, tools that we need as humans, without having to believe unbelievable things in order to get those tools. So I continue to do coaching for anyone on that spectrum. Just if you're deconstructing, if you're reconstructing, I tend to just by now know this space very well. And so I do, a lot of resources and coaching in that space.
Yeah. One of the things, so I checked out your website and looked at some of your different courses, and I just loved all of the different verbiage that was used. I think in one case, you call yourself a nihilism coach. In another, you're talking about, how to frame a life without the woo. And some of these things just speak so true to me because I think a lot of people, when they do deconvert from any religion or even ideology, something more fundamentalist, they hold on to some part or they move towards this new age spirituality and they get involved in crystals and chakras and all kinds of things like that. I don't know where you stand on everything, and I'm sure we're going to get into some things, but I read enough of your website to just see that you find value, it sounds like, in some of the wisdom tradition from religions, but then you're just mixing that with a healthy dose of rationality and critical thinking. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's definitely fair. And you're right that when people first leave religion, often what's the easiest thing for our brains to do is to just essentially find a new religion. And today, a lot of that looks like is deconstructing Christianity and then maybe going over to paganism or kind of new age crystal stuff. And we have to be careful that we're not just replacing one with the other. So if you were a Christian, you escaped death by telling each other stories about grandmas in heaven, and was the coping mechanism. And so when you leave religion, a lot of people don't deconstruct fully and actually do things like face their mortality and do the hard work. It's much easier for the brain to say, oh, here's someone doing reincarnation work or talking about past lives or doing some kind of crystal something, they essentially then just plug that in so that they still don't have to think about death. And it's not because I know what ultimate reality is. I make no claims on what I think ultimate reality is. I just don't think that we know enough. It's more that in light of how little we know and how our truth claims when it comes to gods and lives and planets and our truth claims around all of these things, our batting record is just zero. Like we look back and we say that we've always been wrong. And so it's with intellectual humility that I say, maybe let's play a different game. Instead of trying to do truth claims first and then trying to get access to some of these tools that are really helpful for human well-being, let's just focus on the tool regardless of what's going on with objective reality. And staying away from getting sucked into the cultiness or the dogma or the truth claims or pseudoscience, and just really having some skepticism and critical thinking around these things. And also, though, recognizing that there are tools in religion and spirituality and wisdom traditions that are worth having, that even science says is really good for our mental health and well-being. I want to separate that. And that for me has been the path that is most paid off. And also it tends to be really helpful for people who are leaving religion, who may be allergic to truth claims or they've been burned before, or maybe they're skeptical. This approach for me has been separating the baby from the bathwater and getting all the best of what religion has to offer without any of the dogma and the requirements of truth claims.
I love that. I love that so much. I think you and I are in total agreement, which I'm a little surprised because when I first started watching your video, there were a couple terms you threw out and I thought, oh man, this isn't going to be quite what I thought. And I was actually still excited to speak to you, but I thought there'd be a higher level of pushback. Some of those terms were, one thing you call yourself is a atheist spiritual director. And then I've also heard you talk about, the secular approach to religion. And so still having these loaded words like spiritual and religious was something that, because I was so keen to stay away from that weird middle ground after deconverting, I let the pendulum swing a little more to this side where I wanted it to be nothing but critical thinking, rationality, logic, facts. Those words scared me for a while. And I see people that leave religion and they use these words, and it does lead to more of that woo side. So I've seen enough of your stuff now to know that you've also avoided that. But tell me, let's talk about the terminology a little bit. So you call yourself an atheist spiritual director. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
So being a spiritual director is actually a program. So that was a 2-year program that I did on top of my master's degree to be able to learn the art of sitting with people in their spiritual journey. And so that actually does have some structure around that concept. However, the language in this space is very tricky. And I have to be very careful because we just don't have secular words for a lot of these things. We don't have, something like the umbrella of religion or even just spirituality. I define spirituality as connection to your deepest self and outside of yourself. For me, that doesn't include a higher power. For other people, it does. But for something like religion, it's such a big umbrella. Religion talks about community and art and awe and transcendence and ritual and rites of passage and moral education. There's just all these things under that word. We don't really have a secular counterpart that means all of that, but in a secular connotation. And so what you see in this space, people who are doing work like me, is there's a lot of dual words. So I'm going to say that I'm a spiritual director because I do have a master's degree in theology and I did do a spiritual direction program, but I'm going to add in there that I'm an atheist, which is confusing. But I have to add something in there or I'm going to be misleading people as far as what I do.
Yeah.
And so you get a lot of these dual terms: atheist spiritual director, rational mysticism, secular spirituality, spiritual but not religious. There's just a lot of these word sandwiches that we're trying to make that means there's something here. There's something here that's interesting and even good for us. And there's science that shows it. But can we do it with less superstition and supernatural than we have in the past? Because we're just historically bad at the game of what is God and what is God thinking about today.
Yeah.
Like we need to probably stop playing that game because we're just bad at it. We're just not. And even if there is a God and even if one religion is right, statistically, it's not going to be yours. And so I just think we need to let that go. So I tend to use these words just because I want to reclaim them so that religion doesn't have a monopoly on some of these things that are just human.
Yeah. No, you're right. They're just human. And when you get down under the umbrella, a lot of the terms I think people can relate to much better. You said words like awe or ritual, or we're going to be talking about in one of your 10 points here, the sacred, and even detaching that from its religious roots. I think those words make a lot of sense to people, but you're right. In terms of like a catch-all or those big umbrella terms, we kind of need some new lingo there, or you just have to borrow and keep explaining yourself, because you're right. It's just a delicate environment when it comes to how people relate to these words. I appreciate the clarity there. Tell me a little bit more. I'm split. Part of me wants to get so badly to your video because those are the topics that I love the most. Like the 10 things you cover, I cannot wait. But then another part of me is so intrigued by your academic background. More specifically, and I don't think you mentioned it yet, in one of your videos, you say that you have a focus on the future of American religion. Tell me about that, because as someone who lives in the States, and most of the audience that is watching this lives in the States, and as we see this transition where the nuns are going up, Christianity is going down, but there's still these death throes where it seems almost more intense than ever. And then you've got, maybe Islam coming in and starting to grow, and little cults and spirituality popping up everywhere. The future of American religion seems like the most important and craziest topic to me. Tell me what you mean when you say you have a focus in that.
Yeah. And for someone who doesn't have a master's degree, with a focus in that for you, you did a pretty good job actually mapping out what's going on. But yeah, I was fascinated by this question when I was, deciding what I wanted to focus on and my capstone paper for my master's degree. And I really was interested in Gen Z spirituality. And like you said, okay, people are leaving organized religion. They're still human. They still have all the same needs that they had before, that everybody has. My big driving question is, where is this going? And also the question that is being discussed more today is not whether or not religion is true. It's whether or not religion is good for people, whether or not religion is good for society. And if you've been a person who's been on YouTube for a long time and you went through all the atheist, theist debates and you watched your Christopher Hitchens debates, 20 years ago, the conversation really was, is God real? That conversation did not go very well for theists. And I do think that atheists tended to do better in those debates. The conversation now has shifted. It's no longer about whether God is real. The most recent debate was Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. And that debate was, is religion good for society? Is it necessary for society? And that is actually a more complicated question. That's a question that you really need to dig on. And so I love this idea of seeing where religion and spirituality is going in America with this wave of deconstruction that I was a part of too. I just want to see, where is this going?
Yeah. And you're right. There has been this shift of, let's agree to disagree on the reality of the situation, but let's talk about the usefulness of it, as if the usefulness equals some truth value as well. And your example of Ben Shapiro is good. Additionally, I know Jordan Peterson is big in this space of these meta truths and how we couldn't function without it. And then everyone starts bringing in the Judeo-Christian values. Go ahead.
Right. And with Jordan Peterson, whatever you agree about Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson politically, because they're both politically very divisive, especially today, both of them get a lot of heat for various political statements that they've made. Putting that aside for a second, though, the 4-part debate that they did, I really see as the conversation of our time.
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson, even though I disagree and even though I tend towards maybe the Sam Harris side of things, his fear of nihilism and what happens when God dies are well-founded. That is something to be aware of. And I do think that conversation really was showing the tension of our time, which is, how do we break away from these gods? But then how do we actually build society without a collective myth? We've never done it before. And secularism seems to not be doing that well. And there's some valid concerns that came up in that debate that I think really was the conversation of our time.
I agree. And I've found myself erring on this side where it's like, we've had forever, literally all of human history, to work out the God experiment. And that also didn't go very well. And we're in this transition period, if you will. And yes, I agree, it's a very rocky start and we need to figure out some things seriously and very quickly. And I think that's a lot of the work that you're doing, and I appreciate that so much. But there's been times where I've been pressed on that question of, well, what do you think's going to happen if, no one had a God tomorrow? And yeah, I don't agree that it's going to be sunshine and rainbows, but I do think it might be worth the infancy stage, the problematic stage, to get to what it can be without these things. Again, it's a great experiment. One of the things that helped me frame it better, because I just had this I didn't like, Jordan is still trying to make these truth claims about religion in some capacity. But when it hit me better was actually a conversation between Alex O'Connor and Sam Harris, where Alex kind of played devil's advocate to Sam Harris. I don't know if you saw that, on the topic of morality. And he said, but Sam,
yes,
what if there's just something about religion, about going to church on Sunday? Atheists don't gather. They don't do these community things that are good for us. And maybe you do just need a God to say, I want you here every Sunday, for people to actually get out of bed, put their selfish desires away, and show up. Like, maybe that's what it takes. And that conversation between the two of them, I thought, was more real in that sense than the diametrically opposed, well, I do still think religion is kind of true, and thus I'm arguing for X, where Alex has just seen it from that actual the utility of maybe what religion brings.
And that is such a more interesting conversation than just, is this God true? Because we have more evidence that religion is good for you than we have evidence that your religion is true. And so, that I did watch that conversation, and it was interesting, because he forced Sam Harris to say, if you have to choose between truth and well-being, because at some point with some of these things, we may have to choose between truth and well-being. So for example, if it's true that we don't have free will, but society only functions if people believe that they do, what do we do? What do we choose when we have to choose between truth and human well-being? And Sam said, you have to choose human well-being. And so then if that's true, then he said, if we had good data, if we had good science that said that people can't do this without God, and human well-being is going to go down if everybody kind of confronts nihilism, what would you do? And he said, if I knew that were true, I would pull my books off the shelf, because I would know that it's going to decrease human well-being. And that is an interesting conversation, because we have to have the conversation then of, why is truth valuable then? Because in Christianity, it's like, oh, truth will eventually lead you closer and closer to God. We should seek truth. Okay, but if we leave that, what actually is the value of truth? Because there are many studies that show that the more aware you are, or the more you are kind of aware that things are a matrix, or reality isn't what you think it is, or you don't have free will, it can psychologically unhinge you. You can go down in your well-being through some truths. And so now we have to have the conversation as atheists, as far as, what do we choose when we have to choose between truth and well-being? And I do think that they navigated that conversation very well. And Sam Harris just has, I think, a little bit more faith and optimism. Faith, I shouldn't use that word. He has a little bit more optimism that we can get through the infancy phase, and we're going to have some growing pains, but what's on the other side is going to be better. I'm a little bit more scared than he is. I'm a little bit more pessimistic that, like Nietzsche said when he talked about the death of God, which we'll move into, it was not a celebration. It was not like God is dead and now we're going to run these totally just secular societies. He said God is dead, and in this vacuum, what is coming is going to be worse. And I kind of sense a little bit of that more, that the rise of nihilism, the rise of meaninglessness and numbing behaviors and addiction and suicidality is one thing to pay attention to. And then we've also got the rise of Islam and forms of fundamentalism that will fill that vacuum. And then we have political religions. The first thing that happens in the death of God is a political religion offering everything that God used to.
Yeah. And you mentioned those four things that come in the void. And I definitely want to talk about them more. I think maybe we should move straight into your 10 points here. So you list these 10 things, and some of them are what you actually lose when you also lose God, and some of them are things that can creep up in the absence there. And so we'll go through those. But before we dive into number one, why did you make this video? What do you think is the main goal in having this conversation?
Yeah, I think the lie of atheism, and I'm saying this as an atheist, right? But the lie of atheism is that if you just leave religion, you're going to stumble upon your best life. Like it's just going to like fall upon you. I think Elaine de Botton says this, where, maybe we're not as broken as the Christians tell us we are. where we're just fundamentally broken and born in sin and all of that. But we also are in need of tools, and we're in need of help to help us function in light of our existential fears and everything that it is to just be thrown into a universe that we don't understand as a human. It's hard. And so we're not as broken as the Christians say, but we're not, just leaving religion is not enough for people. They're just going to either form another religion, or they're going to not have tools to be able to function. And we have to realize that as we're leaving this kind of burning house of religion for good reasons, sexual abuse, truth claims, these are solid reasons to be stepping outside the house of organized religion. We have to be aware of the monsters that are around the corner. And I don't think that people in the deconstruction space and even atheists talk about that enough, because it's so easy to get on our high horse that we're right. And it's so easy to make fun of superstition when you feel like you don't need that in your life anymore. But it's much harder to actually discuss the pros and cons of secularism and ways that secularism is not performing well.
Yeah, no, I love it. Nuance is something I preach left and right from my channel. And that is what I'm hearing from you, is the nuance of, we can't help what we end up coming to believe or not believe in, this place of I'm simply not convinced of these certain deistic or theistic claims. That's all that it is. There is nothing more. It is not an offering. It is not a new approach. It is not a new worldview, as many of the theists like to say, well, now you have your atheistic worldview. What is that? And so we are all in the void, and it's time to start adding some order back to that chaos. So let's dive in. Point one of what we lose with the death of God was objective morality.
Yeah, this is one that I do think that theists have a fair argument, which is that without something like a God, it's very difficult to ground morality into some kind of foundation. Now, what usually atheists do will say we can have objective conversations about subjective realities. So it's our subjective reality that we suffer more or suffer less. And so then we can make objective statements about how humans suffer. So that's usually what atheists do. But that is still grounded, even though we're having an objective conversation. Maybe we're using the science of well-being or the science of happiness, and we have data. Like, all of this we can do is science-driven, but it's going to be grounded in human subjectivity. Like, there's nothing universal about any of these principles, even in nature. So something that can die with the death of God is a feeling of objective morality, and that can be difficult for people, especially. It tends to be not as difficult if you were raised secular. You just build your morality on just that suffering is bad. That's the only thing that you have to do. Therefore, we shouldn't cause suffering to others. I am you, you are me. We use conversation and empathy and rationality to be able to construct a moral system. It's good for me. It's good for human well-being to live a moral life, and it's good for everybody else. And so people do that just fine. Something that can be hard when you build your morality on God is that you built your morality on something else. And this is why Christians will sometimes get confused, because if you're raised in that, where your morality is based on something else, something external, then when you lose God, it can feel like, well, what's the point of being moral? And you can even see this in debates with Christians, where they'll say, oh, if I knew tomorrow that God was dead, I'd just go around raping people.
If there is no absolute moral standard, I would indulge in the most sinful lifestyle I could imagine.
It's like, wow, like you really revealed something about yourself you probably shouldn't say publicly. But that's what happens when you build your morality on something external. So I do think that there is a fair argument there that theists will say you do lose objective morality. Fine, we lose objective morality, but building a moral system on our subjective reality of suffering not only can be just as good, but it can tend to be better, because then you can still engage in conversation. Whereas if someone says, I'm going to kill you because God told me to, there's really nothing that you can say at that point. It just takes a shift for people to move into an external, related, grounded, objective morality to one that is based on subjectivity. And that can be a shift for people.
It's funny because on one hand, I see it as one of the biggest issues. And then on the other hand, it's like, where it comes into play more is when you are deconstructing or deconverting and you still have the Christian influences in your life telling you like, hey, without this, it's almost this great facade. It's true you lose the grounding, but it's not true that you lose the ability to be moral or that you care about morality.
Exactly.
And that distinction is one
Yes.
that Christians, of course, don't offer up when they talk about what you're losing. And so to someone in peril going through this incredible transition, it's like, oh man. And then, if you haven't thought much, especially, through this philosophically, you're kind of lost in, well, I still feel this way. I still feel it's wrong to do this, but they're right. I don't have a right to feel that way, as they say.
And then you add kids to that, and it's like, how do I raise my kids without this moral education that I came from religion? How do I tell them, when it's not grounded? So you're right. I love that distinction that, yes, we live with objective morality, but it doesn't mean we can't build morality in other ways. It's just, if you've only done it in one way and you lose it, it can be a shift. You're going to have to learn how to do that.
I'm curious what your advice would be. I'll share first the thing that helped me the most. It was even kind of recent, because I'm not out there doing public debates, but I'm in a very confrontational space where this comes up all the time. I'll say an issue with Christianity, and then bam, that's the first thing. Who are you to say that's wrong? You can't even say it's wrong from your belief. They can't even understand an internal critique. So I'm always looking for the best answer. But one of the things I heard recently that I loved was that morality is a skill. I don't think it's all encompassing. I don't think that's perfectly true, but I think it's incredibly useful of a definition that if you look at evolutionary history and the ability to empathize and trade and, get someone's back, even when it doesn't immediately, result in you getting yours until later, that it's a skill that as people developed it, they developed further and they progressed and they had more well-being and some of these things. But I'm curious what advice you would give to people in the void, in the middle, deconstructing, who have fully been deconverted, who are struggling with this. How should they be thinking about morality then if it's not fully grounded in something objective?
Yeah. So for me, I went a different way with that one, which is, I still have a mystic teacher and I still read a lot of things in mysticism, just to kind of tag that word. Mystics or mysticism is appreciating the experience of what people have called God without having to put a name to it or a religion around it. It's just appreciating the experience of especially these transcendent experiences that we can have as humans. And so what mysticism will say is that religion does, here's a story, Adam and Eve, whatever it is, and then here's your ethics, here's your list of do's and don'ts, and then you can move into being. This is like Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where the law is written on your heart, where you be a good person just because you know that I am you and you are me. And so what mysticism does is, instead of going story, ethics, being, it does that in reverse. So mystics will start with just your beingness, what it is to be human and what it is to suffer and what it is that someone else is a human just like you, with a story just like you. And everybody has a story that will break your heart if you listen to them long enough. And you know what it's like to suffer. And so mystics just start there. Let's just start there with just, we're human. What does it feel like? This beingness of our human experience. And then once you're there, ethics flow naturally. I don't need a list of do's and don'ts. I'm not going to steal from you because I am you and you are me. And why would I do that to you? I wouldn't want that done to me. And then story is the place that's not literal. It's just the place that we go to play. These are mirrors and playgrounds where we can learn about ourselves in different parts of our psyche. And so for me, I approached it that way, that just being able to shift it away from an objective morality that's grounded in something other than me. I'm just going to ground it in my human experience. I'm going to ground my life and my morality from the point of view of experience. It's this switch. It's this flip from going from building your life on external truths, God, objective morality, grand stories, and actually starting from the ground up and building your life in morality and meaning from the point of view of experience. And that's a mystic shift that I find is really helpful for people.
Yeah, I think it's a really beautiful idea. Of course, the pushback there, especially from the theist, is, okay, that might answer it for you, thus making it incredibly subjective. But then how do you group people? How do you choose what laws are best for society? What would your answer be back? I'm just curious to the people that say, okay, it sounds like that's very useful for the individual, but what about for the group?
Yeah, this is where we can shift towards, people will say that if everything is subjective, then you're living by your laws and I'm living by my laws. And, I decide that it's good that I want to kill you. This is what Christians will always say in debate. And so how do you manage that when everybody has a different subjective experience on what is good or not? And if we can get to a place where our conversations in government and policy making and in society are really grounded in human well-being, we can start there, because we actually have more data than people think that we do, and actual science that shows that these things tend towards human well-being and these things don't. And so I think that's a place where both the religious and the non-religious can land, because you can't, as a religion, hopefully you'll get enough pushback as a religion, you can't say that you don't want human well-being, right? They're going to say that, maybe they're going to say that it comes from God, but like, you can't argue that this is a bad thing. Okay, so let's start there. And then the non-religious people can do well-being. They want people to, humans to thrive and flourish too. And so instead of going from, if we can just decide what's true and then we'll build the correct theocracy, for society. Let's not do that. That tends to be bad. Instead of that, let's just work towards human well-being. Now, it's like physical well-being. I can't give you maybe the perfect diet for your body and your lifestyle and your life. Maybe we can't do that. But I can say we have solid data that shows that these foods and activities tend towards better physical health, and these comparison. Ones don't. Yeah. And that's enough for us to get started, even if we don't have a perfect layout of what a perfect, human life should be or a perfect society should be. We have enough to get started. And so let's just start there. Let's work on reducing suffering and the project of human well-being. That's enough to get us started.
I love that. No, that's fantastic. And I agree. You're right. There are certain things that are obvious enough from the data to start with, and there will be nuance left over, and that's fine. That's okay. We don't have to have it all figured out all the time. Nothing will ever work 100% for everyone. Let's move into number 2, ultimate justice. And this is one that is, I think, linked to number 1, but has its own nuance as well. So why don't you explain this point for us?
Yeah, this one was difficult for me personally. And so I kind of went into this more just with my personal experience, where I had watched the documentary on Netflix. I don't know if it's still on there, on this little boy named Gabriel Hernandez. And he was kept in a cage, and he was starved, and he was abused, and he was beaten, and he was killed by his parents. And it's just awful. And I used to have this nice comfort blanket that said, he's in heaven with Jesus now. And it's this spiritual bypassing that you can do. Spiritual bypassing is just using spirituality to not feel feelings that you don't want to feel. And so I used to just be able to bypass those heavy feelings by saying, at least he's with Jesus now. He's fine. He's doing even better now. Right. And then I wouldn't have to fully feel the weight of that. And then after I lost God, I laid on my couch for 3 days after watching that documentary. I still, if I see that little boy's face or something will remind me of him, I'll just burst into tears, because I had to face what I see as the reality, which is some people truly do just come into this world and just suffer and don't even get maybe a moment of love and compassion and safety, and then they die. And that crushed me. It crushed my soul. I think in that moment, if there was a big red button that would have just destroyed all life on earth, I would have just pushed it, because it was so devastating to me to have to face the lack of justice. And so much of what we do when we create heavens, and we have evidence of this, we create heavens in order to deal with this internal sense that there should be justice, and this disconnect with reality that there's apparently not. And this is why we even create hell in the New Testament. We create hell in the Old Testament. The afterlife didn't have any moral distinctions. It was just the afterlife. Yeah. And it's not until we get into the New Testament, where they're an occupied people, where it's unfair, they're being occupied by the Romans, that then they create hell in order to say this is not fair. And if justice doesn't happen in this life, it must then happen in the next.
Yeah, just a bit of an overreach with that ultimate justice, though. No, I'm just being snarky.
Yeah.
I think actually it's an important distinction, because of course, from being a Christian for 30 years, heaven is exactly what you're talking about, this spiritual bypassing. Thank you for the new terminology. I think that's perfect. What actually started to help me deconvert, this hit you after the fact. Mine was the unfairness and injustice of hell, no matter how bad the person is. Especially, I think both of us have lost our belief in free will. That makes it even more egregious. So even within a heaven and hell concept, justice completely breaks down unless you just want to be very myopic about like, well, bad people deserve bad things forever and good people to some degree will get good things. And I think that the Christian version is one of the weakest. You know, if you want to talk about some karma or reincarnation or something like that, I think that's closer to a better system of this spiritual bypassment. But sorry, just those will trigger me into little diatribes. So I apologize. Let's get back to what you were saying.
No, that's okay. Yeah, just so you know, Mormons don't have really a belief in hell. They believe that even if you were a bad person and went to kind of the bad heaven, it's still better than this life. And so I never actually believed in a hell like you're describing, because it's just so incredibly unethical and hard to believe that a good God would do that, especially as a parent. Like, you're trying to tell God that he's a good parent. And it reminds me of when they asked Tertullian, he's an early church father, they asked Tertullian, what's the best thing about being in heaven? And there's something really petty about his answer, which is you get to stand on the edge of heaven and watch the suffering of the damned. And there is something about a creation of hell that is very like, I want to punish people who I didn't like or who told me that I was wrong. And I want to say, I told you so. There's just something so petty about that.
I think it's fascinating, though, because it's not just Tertullian. I believe also in Augustine's main work, he talks about the same kind of defense and joy of heaven. You know, it was posed to him, what about your family suffering in hell if you have non-believers in your family? And to which his answer was, well, we will be so filled with the righteousness of Christ that we will take pleasure in the true justice being done. And that comes straight from either Revelation 16 or 19, where you have the elders, the eternal smoke is coming up from the suffering of hell, and they are rejoicing, shouting out loud at the goodness of God's justice. So it's like, if you believe this concept at all, you almost have to arrive at that conclusion, which is disgusting. So I am going to get off my high horse about justice. You're going to love this.
I know, but I'm going to give you one more thing. Just because I know that you're going to love it. There's this Hindu story that I think you're going to love. And I would butcher the words, so I'm just going to give you the summary here. But essentially, there's this Hindu story of a father who goes and he visits his family in hell because his family had made poor choices or whatever. And then he gets to go to heaven. He gets to live a good life in heaven. And he then chooses to stay with his family in hell. And then he finds out that was a test and he passed the test. And now all his family goes to heaven.
I do love that.
And this is where I do think that anti-theists have a leg up, because anti-theists, people like Christopher Hitchens, say, if there is this God and if there is this hell, then I would choose to go to hell in solidarity with my brothers and sisters, because this is wrong and this is evil. And I do think that there's something a little bit more moral about that, rather than rejoicing in eternal suffering.
Yeah.
It just feels really
No, I love that story. If afterwards you can find the specifics and send it to me, I'd love to cover that too.
I will. Yeah, I will.
But back to just the loss of this, because regardless of how much I want to drone on about how unfair the system is anyways, you are right that religion does offer this. And it's, if anything, I would just even frame it as a sense of peace. You know, every single time I've ever had someone I know who knows someone that dies, it's the first thing out of their mouth. They're with Jesus now. Their body's fixed. They're perfect. They're not suffering anymore. And of course, that is a legitimate sense of relief. And of course, it helps us face the issues around pain and death, aside from all the issues I mentioned. So what do we do in the absence of that?
We feel it. We have to face our death. We have to face our mortality, and there are benefits to doing so. And we also have to feel suffering in a way that changes us. And so even though I don't have a nice story for Gabriel Hernandez, would it be great if he was frolicking in meadows in the afterlife? That'd be fantastic. But I don't have a story that makes his life and his story okay. The best I can do is feel it and have my life change because he lived. And does that feel great? No, but that is the best that we can do. And he really did change how I treat children, how I notice signs for abuse, how I spend my money even. And so we feel it and we let it change us. And in that way, he still mattered and his story still mattered. Now, is that as fluffy of a story as other stories that people can give for Gabriel Hernandez? No, it's not very fluffy, but it's maybe the best that we can do in a world with so much suffering, is to feel it and allow it to change us.
No, I think it's beautiful. And I think it's actually the only thing, of course, if we're agreeing that there isn't any afterlife system, that creates positive change. You know, it might not be heaven for him, but it's heaven for another child that is going to not suffer in the same way because of some awareness of you or myself or anyone else.
And the story for me that highlights what you're talking about is the story of Mother Teresa. It's like, was she a good person and was she maybe trying to do good things for the world? Even if I give her that, sure, but her beliefs actually really do cause suffering, because she would just say your suffering is good, it helps you to get closer to Christ.
Right.
Or they died now and so now they're in heaven. And maybe we could have actually done more without those beliefs standing in the way.
Yeah.
As far as trying to make the one life we know we have for people to suffer less. And I do wish religion was more on board with that, but they can't be, because they have this nice fluffy story that the next life's going to be better and it's all going to be okay. We do act better when we realize the only people that are going to save us is ourselves.
Yeah. No, I love your answer. Your answer is to deal with it, to bear the burden. It's funny, in this way, we are more like Christ than many Christians.
Take up your cross.
Yes,
yeah.
we will bear the burden. And what comes with that burden is hopefully action to some degree for alleviation of that suffering. So next up is one that I'm really excited to talk about. You know, I think people always talk about justice and morality and truth in these conversations, and they're important, and I love that we did, but the sacred is one that I think can just get bypassed by people in this deconstruction process. I'll let you kick it off here and tell us what this is all about.
There is a shift that can happen in the death of God where religions can point to the transcendent. They can point to the numinous. They at least have language and encouragement and invitations into these spaces, into these states of consciousness where you feel less neurotic, where you feel connected, you feel even a sense of oneness. And we can lose that with the death of God, especially when it then forces us to realize how brutal nature is. And I think it's Neil deGrasse Tyson on Earth Day who's like, hey, there's a lot of romanticizing going on here about nature and about how it's, cooperative. Everything on this planet would kill you if it could. Everything is trying to kill everything else. Like, let's calm down about that. And so we can, without God, lose a sense of the transcendent, or at least lose third spaces or invitations into those spaces unless you're curating them on purpose by yourself. And that is hard to do. As Elaine de Botton says, if you ask an atheist whether it's good to lay down and watch a starry sky and just, it's very good for you, just gives you so much awe, and it's a very good experience to lay down and look at a starry sky, but there's no date on the calendar for atheists to gather and look at the starry sky. And so what usually happens is we just lay down and watch Netflix and get high instead. And so we can lose that kind of push to the transcendent that religion is always trying to pull you towards. Now, does that mean that you can't have these experiences without God? Absolutely not. I continue to have spiritual and transcendent experiences, probably more so since leaving religion, but I do have to work harder and be more intentional about having that be a rhythm and part of my life, rather than in religion where it's just always kind of pointing you there. So we can't, you can lose a sense of the sacred because you're losing the community and the rituals and the invitations and the third spaces that help you to have that be a part of your life. Yeah.
I know one of the later points is tradition. So I'll try not to talk too much about the community here because I think it plays more there. But I realized when I deconverted, just to give an anecdotal experience here, that much of what I appreciated, what I had claimed as a relationship with Jesus or previously believed was the Holy Spirit, on my heart in my quiet times, was the ritualistic nature of taking that time apart, being quiet in the dark, meditating, focusing. And Sam Harris's book, Why We're Giving Him So Much Credit, Waking Up, talks about this great transition from prayer to meditation and what's similar about these things. But yeah, I've always been a wilderness backpacker, and I used to go to the mountaintops to be closer to God, like my biblical heroes. And now those hikes have become even more meaningful as this time of solitude and appreciation. And it's still beautiful, but you're right. It takes a lot more intention, I think was the perfect word that you used. What is the data or the science behind how important this is to the human, for our psyche, for our well-being? Do you have anything there?
We do. We have a really big landmark study that was done in 2008, specifically on awe and why we developed this evolutionary ability to look at the stars and have an experience. And when you look at the science of awe, you can take people, for example, in the study, people were asked to draw themselves. And if you took them out to Yosemite National Park and you did kind of, you explained what was going on and it gave people a sense of awe, they would draw themselves very small on a piece of paper. Whereas if you just grab someone just in the city off the street, they'll draw themselves really big on the piece of paper. The experimenter would drop pencils, and the people who felt awe were more likely to help the person pick up their pencils. And so we have all this data that shows that having these moments of awe help to break us away from our neurotic, self-obsessed thinking that we get caught into. And these moments of awe breaks us of our neurotic patterns, and it helps us with social cohesion. We're more likely to forgive. We're more likely to look past grudges and let them go. We're more likely to just feel connected to each other. We have solid science that shows that this is very good for your brain to have these experiences. And when you're now operating outside of a religion, you have to then learn, how do I experience connection? And we have studies on this too. There's many, contemplation and meditation is one way, but so is art, and so is political activism, and so is exercise. Some people, it's really moving their body that gets them to this place. So you have to actually learn, how is it that I connect? How is it that I experience this thing? And how can I put it more regularly in my life? Now, I will argue that the end result is going to be better for you because it's going to be more tailored to you. It's going to be more authentic. But is it more work? Yeah, it's going to be more work, because religion will just say, here, do this, try this. It'll kind of keep that reminder for you. So you do have to be more intentional when you're trying to do these things outside of religion, which is, again, something I want to challenge atheists to do. That, okay, religion is wrong and it did it poorly. We've got to do it better, or we need to get off our high horse.
Yeah. No, I love that. Great call out, and good advice too. It might take some time to even discover what it is that does it for you in the absence of religion. But I hear it all the time in my comments. I put out a Sunday video every single Sunday at 9 a.m. Central, and people in the comments are often saying, I'm here now instead of at church, and then after this, I'm going to go do this. I go do a bike ride with my buddy, and we go to a new coffee shop each Sunday. And it's, hearing what people have replaced that church time with that has become incredibly meaningful, because it's still when most people are free. Sunday mornings, the weekend, it's this new start. And I do think a lot of people organically do that. But yes, I would encourage everyone to be even more intentional with it.
Even more intentional. Yeah, that take everything that you were doing in religion, don't throw it away, just replace it. So if you, do family church, or do your bike ride and listen to your podcast as church. Maybe don't give all your money to the church. For me in Mormonism, I gave 10% of my money to a church. Less than 1% went to humanitarian aid. Most of it went to paying for temples and churches and administration and all these things. So don't stop doing tithing. But now, I give to my local women and children's shelter. And so, that's what I think atheists can sometimes do, is especially when we're in that stage that you talked about where you just want to throw it all away. And maybe we need to for a little bit just to heal and get some space. Sure. But I do encourage that, hey, the reason that religion co-evolved with us is because it has tools. So let's not throw all these tools away, especially for kids.
Yes.
Let's just make them better.
Yeah. No, I love it. I love it so much. Thank you for that. Let's move on to number 4, which is truth. And I think we've covered this in a few ways, so we don't have to spend forever here. But what do you mean when you say that we lose truth?
It's really interesting. Nietzsche, I think, was really brilliant when he talked about how Christian deconstruction was the natural thing that was going to happen, because Christianity had elements in the doctrine that said we should be seeking for truth because truth is going to lead us to God. There's concepts of like a logos and an order, and we need to understand this. And so what eventually happens then, the natural effect that happens from that stance is eventually all of our truth seeking and our studiousness and all the skills that we developed in Christianity then turn on itself and start to deconstruct itself. That was just the natural path for Christianity to take because it was seeking for truth. And I thought that that was really interesting. And so now we have to have the conversation. And again, we mentioned it before, so I'll just be really brief. We have to have the conversation of why is truth good? And are there times when truth is not good? And what do we do when truth is not good?
Yeah.
And that is a more complex conversation
hard.
because we had the assumption under Christianity that truth was going to be good, that truth is good, and we should seek it. And now with the death of God, we actually have to re-ask ourselves that question. How much truth is actually good for you?
Yeah.
And then publicly, how much truth is good for the public to know? And that gets us down some serious
Rocky.
rabbit holes.
Yeah. It's funny because the tagline for my channel is being willing to follow truth wherever it goes. But like you're saying, one of the places that it might go is that it's kind of paradoxical. It's not the end all be all. And if the truth of that is that well-being is more important than truth in certain aspects and to certain degrees, then it's almost because you're following the truth that you have to let it go a little bit. How do you make those distinctions? How do you weigh the differences between something like well-being and truth?
Yeah, I'm much more humble now in my approach to it. I will say that I went through kind of like a cocky atheist phase where I just really enjoyed being right. And I was smug about it, and I'll admit it. And that's fine. Maybe I needed to go through that, and everybody needs to go through their kind of 4 horsemen of the atheist apocalypse and read all of their stuff. And then I began to see more why some truth brings human well-being down. And when I had to really ask myself, for someone like my dad, who's still an active Mormon, and I actually think that Mormonism is good for him, for where he is in his life, do I really want my dad to suffer because I want to be right? What's the point of being right if my dad is going to suffer? Or I have a brother who's an addict. And statistically, if you find Jesus as part of your recovery, to lose Jesus is really dangerous for your sobriety. Sure. So do I want to be right, or do I want my brother to be sober? And that really challenged me and made me see that even though I think I'm right when it comes to questions about God, I've studied it enough. When it comes to human well-being, human suffering has to matter. Otherwise, you're no better than the Christians who say, I'm right, so you're going to hell and I don't care if you suffer.
Putting some kind
if
of
I'm an
dogma
atheist
over
and the
individual.
truth is... Yeah, if I'm an atheist and I think that I'm right, and I'm going to push it on someone, even though the truth is going to hurt them, like I deal with nihilistic people who are very suicidal after they leave religion. Do I want that? No, I don't want to be right enough that I want you to die because of what's going on here. I'm much more gentle about how I talk about this. And so I tend to be hard on ideas that cause harm in the world, but really soft to people, because I was once a believer too. And I do think that there's some truth. Neil Brennan said this in one of his comedy specials, that atheism is the ultimate white privilege. And I do think that there is some privilege involved in being an atheist, because it means that you're able to get these resources without religion. And that requires at least a little bit of privilege. And so going into, for example, me as a white atheist, it would be very unethical, I think, for me to walk into a Black church that has had this restoration theology that helped them to get through slavery as a community and as a people. And to just be able to say, by the way, you guys are all wrong. There's something a little bit unethical about that from my place of privilege. And so we have to realize that religion is a coping tool. And until you can know that you can offer a better coping tool, it's unethical to take away people's coping tools that leads to more suffering for people. Now, that doesn't mean that I just say nothing about religion or God. I'm still going to challenge these ideas. I'm still going to leave resources for people who are deconstructing, but I'm much more gentle about it, because I have the humility to say, I don't know if this truth is going to be good for you. So I'm not going to push it on you, because human well-being should matter.
It's a tough balance, because I find myself like shouting your praises right now and agreeing, and then there's a part of me that is pushing back. Let me air out the thoughts here, and I'm curious to hear what you say. I've long thought that, I don't want to make it as trite as this, but it's almost like there's just certain personality types, for lack of a better word, that seem to need or be better well suited for religion. Mine wasn't one of them. I was so concerned with truth and value and suffering that I couldn't do it anymore. But I think about my wife, who is still a believer, and I don't know if her well-being would be better if she lost her faith. I think the claim of her truth is incorrect, but I think that the benefit of her community and her reality under this umbrella of religion is more beneficial than maybe what it would be otherwise, just because of her personality as an individual. The other side to that coin, though, because I hear what you're saying. So for her, for your brother, for your dad, these potential realities for them to maybe be better off. But does it propagate the religion continuing? Right. And so it's like the first thing to weigh is the individual's well-being versus this, I want to be right or the truth. But then the second thing is, well, if so many of these individuals continue to believe and it's better for them individually, it will continue to propagate the cycle that if we actually believe, and I do, that religion, specifically speaking for Christianity, is inherently harmful, that there's a baggage that comes with believing it. I think, and I'll stop the diatribe in a second, but part of the reason I think my wife needs the religion as much as she does right now is because of how broken the religion told her she was, right? If she is this sinful from birth, needing hell, it's been playing on her psyche for 30 years. The comfort that she gets from this religion that would be so lost if she came to what I consider the truth. Yes, but only because it gave you the problem in the first place. And I don't want to continue to promote that elsewhere. And so that's like the thing going off in my head of I hear you, and from an individual level, it's something to consider. But is there a part of you that just says, ultimately, wouldn't it be better if we didn't have this belief concept?
Yeah. It's such a good ethical landscape that you just laid out there.
Sorry,
and
it felt messy,
but I feel
think
both
you
of these.
Get what I'm saying?
No, I get it. And this is the conversation really about religious moderates. So a conversation in my field is often whether religious moderates are helping religion become better and more nuanced and lose some of the worst things, or by these people like this, like Richard Rohr type of Christian people, are these people who can speak so beautifully and intelligently about religion, are they actually indirectly supporting fundamentalism?
Yeah, making a way,
because
sure.
People will look at smart people and just say, well, he believes in Jesus and he's so smart and he's such a good person and he has these philosophy degrees and whatever. Eventually I came to the conclusion that I think that critics are right. I think that religious moderates do lengthen the life of some of these religions. So for something like Mormonism, am I appreciative of all the nuanced Mormons who are trying to help make the church healthier? Yes, like nuanced religion is going to be better than fundamentalist religion every time. But I do think that if they all left, that it would almost shorten the lifespan of this religion that really doesn't need to exist. Like we can survive without Mormonism. It's a very small, rich religion. We can redistribute that wealth in a better way than it is right now.
Yeah.
And so I am on the board of I do think that religious moderates are supporting fundamentalism more than they realize. What I would only say, though, is that we need to allow people to be able to transition. And we need every spot on that path for someone to be there for that transition.
Yeah.
I did not go from Mormon to atheist in a day. It's probably impossible. Your brain can only change 1% of your worldview at a time. I didn't believe by the time I was 14 or 15, but it took me another 10 years to actually leave the building, like physically leave the building. And it took me another 10 years after that, or 5 years after that, to let go of God, because I had to face my fears of nihilism and I needed some tools for that. I do think that we have to allow people the grace to be able to transition, because I didn't do it in a day. And if I was listening to this conversation when I was 20, it would have gone probably completely over my head.
Yeah.
And I'm the one who's here, right? Yeah. And so if I give myself the grace that I needed some time to work with these things and transition, we also have to give other people that same benefit. And for you and me, we have a high value of truth seeker, and not everybody operates under that value. My husband took a lot longer to leave the church because his core value is loyalty. He didn't give a shit about the doctrine. I was reading all this doctrine stuff. His core value is loyalty. That's a very different way to look at the world. And so for me to say, you have to do it my way because my core value is the best, that's actually just not kind to the way that other people operate. So
No, well said.
It's messy. I don't have like a rule.
Yeah.
I just think that both are true. I think we have to treat people with grace and allow religions to transition and get better over time for the people who are in it. And also we can push back on religious moderates who are often using these very flowery language I heard one the other day that was trying to make the second coming about personal inner transformation. And it's like, I love what you're saying. It's great. But like, we've gone so far from what the average person thinks the word second coming means. That like it's to the point that we're being intellectually dishonest. And I do think that we should call that out. So it's both. I want to give people grace and I want to call out, we don't have to do it this way. There are better ways.
Yeah. And by the way, I completely agree. I mean, my wife and I barely even talk about this. It's funny for me having the channel and then like my real world relationship with every single person in my life, my best friends, my family, my wife. Every single person I know in real life is a Christian. Yeah, you can't live the way of just, I'm right, you're wrong all the time. And I so much appreciate the empathetic approach too, and the timely approach. And these things just, they can't happen maybe in the way that we would want if we were designing it. But yeah, very good. I think there's probably more to say with truth, but I like where we went with it. Was there anything else you wanted to say before we move on?
No, let's go on to the next one. So the next one is feelings of isolation. Did you have something that you wanted to start with on this one, or you want me to go?
I think it's a natural extension to what we've already covered, that when you leave so much. I believe that the isolation that happens is twofold. I think there's a personal isolation that happens from losing what used to be your sense of comfort and your base, whether we are talking about truth or morality or meaning or any of those great concepts. And then there's a real true physical outward isolation of, for many people, losing the group, losing the community, not going to church anymore, not feeling welcome at your small group, not fitting in. My personal example, I just mentioned everyone in my life is a Christian. My son is on a football team. I would have loved to coach for it, but because my wife is still a believer, we're in this kind of like from a Christian school perspective football program where the coaches have to do Bible studies at halftime and stuff. And I just can't do that. I don't feel good doing that. I'm missing out of that community. I'm not invited to certain things. I don't participate in the same way. That's an isolation as a tiny example of what so many people go through when they become the black sheep, the odd man out in their circles, their communities. But I'd love to hear more from the data side of what that does to the individual.
Yeah, so there's really two things that happen. And isolation is one of our 4 existential fears. So our 4 existential fears are meaninglessness, death, isolation, and fear of freedom, which we'll do in another podcast because that's too much.
I'd love to talk about that.
But yeah, it's super interesting. This guy named Irvin Yalom, who really researched the existential fears that drive our behavior. A lot of it goes with terror management theory studies today. But anyway, our fear of isolation happens 2 ways. So you outlined, what happens in our community. Same thing happened to me. Like, I can't go to Mormon weddings. They're in a Mormon temple. I don't have a temple recommend. Those things will always hurt. But there's another layer to isolation, which is also losing the idea that God is watching and God understands and God understands you. And God is like, when you do something good, God is there cheering you on. And when you go through something hard, God understands. And losing both at the same time can be really difficult for people. What I did for Lent one time is, Peter Rollins will do atheism for Lent. I had a friend, a believer friend, who did atheism for Lent. By then I was already an atheist. So I said, I'm going to do theism for Lent, and then we'll compare notes at the end. So I lived for 40 days as if I believed, and I did all the things that I used to do. And I'm going to fully do the experiment as best I can. I'm going to jump into this experience and feel what it's like again to truly try to believe in God every day. The thing that stood out to me overall was how comforting it is to think in every situation that someone has a plan for you, or someone saw that, or someone understands that. And how much I missed that feeling from being a believer. Because now if I do something good, I can pat myself on the back, or if I do something kind that nobody saw, I can validate myself. But there is something different about feeling like your life is truly being witnessed.
Yes.
And that even though no human can understand you, God can understand you.
Yeah.
And losing that, along with losing, in my case, my marriage was super rocky, and now my family situation is super rocky on both sides of my family. To go through that all at once can just feel so isolating, and isolation is not something that is good for the human brain. It feels like you're dying because we're a social, tribal creature, animal. And we're also losing something bigger than our community, which is this witness that we felt like we had.
I love that you say that. There's a poet, gosh, I wish I could recall, and he talks about why growing old is actually terrible. And it's because you become less observed. Your children are gone and they're not looking up to you anymore, or even witnessing your life. Maybe your loved one has died. Your parents are gone. They're not, your circle continues to shrink. And so by the time you're in this case, old man in a recliner by yourself, there's no one there to observe your life. And I'm sure such a huge comfort, and I can see it now that you bring it up in that way, is that the greatest being who can ever be is a personal witness to every aspect of your life, which could also be bad for many things, but not being witnessed, not being observed, I think it takes away so much meaning. I see that very much. So what do we do with that?
And you bring up a good point, which is men struggle with this more than women. So when women leave the church, if I were to call up some girlfriends and say, do you guys have time? Do you want to go to lunch? I really want to talk about some stuff that's going on in my marriage and some things that I'm dealing with one of my kids. And I'm feeling these feelings of nihilism, and I just want to talk all this out. I will have 5 or 6 girlfriends go to lunch with me and talk about all that. All of that is socially appropriate for women. Women will cry at a dinner table, will hug each other, will tend to each other. Yeah. That's very natural. We can do that outside of church. For men, this is a hard one, because we don't have socially acceptable ways, usually just because of our homophobia and individualism and all of our American whatever. We don't have socially acceptable ways for men to do the same outside of church. So for many men, we really have data that they'll leave the church, and at least for a time, their well-being is going to take a hit. It's going to go down. It's not going to go up, because where else in society, like for something like Mormonism, by the time you're an old man, you have leadership callings and you're very special. You get to close the meeting. There's all this stuff, and it's bullshit, but I can see why it's so good, because an old man feels like he has wisdom to impart and has value and mentors others and is still being witnessed and valued in a way that he never would, especially retired men who are no longer working, who lose their kind of provider identity. Mm-hmm. Secular society has nothing for them, where at least church says, you're very important. We want to hear you over the pulpit.
You're an elder now.
That's going to feel really good. That's going to feel really good. So men struggle with this far more than women. And it's something that men have to be aware of when they're leaving religion, and also intentionally and in some ways go against society and say, I really want to get a group of men together and go skiing together, and I want to talk about some stuff. And it's going to feel vulnerable. But if you're the one who can do it, there's so many men who are wanting that and wishing for that, but everybody's just waiting for somebody else to put their neck out first. But it's much easier for women to deal with the isolation aspect than it is for men. And that we have to talk about, because I do think that the male loneliness epidemic and the mental health epidemic for men, this is something that secularism has not provided something better than what religion has.
Yeah. I know for myself, it's easy to just be like, yeah, but religion is so bad, and you just immediately kind of lose the thread, and you're like, well, this has got to be better. And plus it's just reality. What are you going to do? But taking the proactive approach of being willing to, because it sucks to be wrong again. You were wrong about your religion that you left, and you think that things are going to be better, or at least the truth holds some unique whatever. And then you realize, and I've come to this realization, I think many people have, no, there's still a ton wrong over here. There's still a ton missing. There's still a ton of brokenness. There's still stuff religion was right about. And it's this conceit that sucks. But I love the proactive nature of, and that's why I was so attracted to this video of saying, here's what's wrong. Here's what needs attention, at least. And we should be thinking about these things, and then offering certain resources to help combat that. So I love that. Thank you for that. I think similar too is number 6. I love the progression you went. Afterlife Assurance. How do you differentiate that between what you lose with the sense of ultimate justice? What is the unique aspect to losing the afterlife in general?
So a lot of this comes from terror management theories, where we actually finally dug into the studies of how much of our behavior really is compartmentalizing and dealing with the fact that rationally we're smart enough to know that we're going to die. And it was shocking how much of our behavior at root level is sneaky ways that we cheat death. So if you remind people that they're going to die, they'll act differently. They will sit closer to their tribe and be more judgmental of other tribes because we want our culture to survive. Because if our culture survives, then our lives have meaning. And we start talking about legacy, or we want something to outlive us. Hamilton says, God help and forgive me. I want to build something that's going to outlive me. This is our fear of death. And then we'll talk about children, or we will also do more numbing behaviors. People will shop more if they're reminded that they're going to die. There's so much going on underneath the surface of our attention that is really death management, dealing with our anxieties that we know that people around us are going to die and we're going to die. And we compartmentalize that so deeply into our subconscious that we're actually surprised when people die. And I love this line on Sherlock. Sherlock's like, why are people surprised when people die? It's the only thing that people consistently do. And so, but it's almost like a shock to us when someone dies because we've compartmentalized this so deeply. So what happens then if we lose our afterlife insurance is all of a sudden now at 40 years old with no tools, you have to face the fact for the first time that you're going to die.
Wow, I see.
And that can be very difficult for people. And some people will say, hey, it's not rational. Like, I know that I'm going to die and maybe it's not going to be bad in the next life, but their brain will think of just floating in nothingness and floating in the abyss. People have very strong fears about that. People will still have fears of hell. People will have fears of not existing or the process of death or just the fear of not knowing when it's going to happen. There's so much fear involved in humans getting smart enough to realize that they're going to die. And really our first signs of religion, burying people with things that had value to the living, but we're burying with the dead, shows up when we seem to be smart enough to know that we're going to die. We need tools for that. Otherwise, you're just faced head on with death anxiety, and we do not function well with it, which is why we developed these stories in religion in the first place. We do a lot of sneaky things in our brain to not think about death. We have to provide tools to be able to face our fear of death so that death becomes a friend.
It's absolutely fascinating. I think it's one of the topics I love the most, and I'd almost want to schedule a second podcast to go deeper into all this terror management theory and death anxiety. I notice it in myself. You know, I've gone through, of course, all of my own evolutions of existential dread. And even when I think I'm okay with the concept of dying, and I really actually do believe that non-existence is so much better than any offered afterlife that I've heard of so far, at least. I'm on board with that. And yet still, as you talk about these sneaky things our brain does, I immediately, after having thoughts like that, even right now, go into things like, but my children will remember me well like this, or, you know, maybe there will be that leftover from the person I helped and then they help their kids and I'll live on in this way. We seek it so bad. And maybe instead of like this seeking for meaning, it is, or at least in balance with this death anxiety. I'm curious, without offering some compensation of afterlife, the only thing I've read about lately that has really reduced death anxiety is psychedelics being used correctly, which is a whole nother topic. But from your research, from like, obviously you brought this up as an issue, what are the things we can do for that 40-year-old facing this for the first time with no tools? What are the tools?
Yeah, so it's really similar to exposure therapy. So if you were afraid of a spider, first we would sit and we would have a picture of a spider and we would just sit with our anxiety. And then we'd realize that, our anxiety didn't kill us. And then the next session, there'd be a spider in a jar at the corner of the room. And we continue actually getting closer to it until you can actually handle, you train essentially your nervous system to be able to handle sitting next to a spider. And we do the same thing with death. We actually have to get closer to it. So some sects of Buddhism, for example, have you meditate next to varying levels of decomposing corpses. And you just sit there and you just have to face that and you have to sit in your feelings. And some sects of Buddhism even will remind you 6 times a day. It's almost like a Muslim 5 times a day, but it's 6 times a day you are reminded of death. And so there's actually apps you can get that will remind you however many times that you want that you're going to die, because this is a tool that helps you get closer to this. And when you get closer and actually realize that your fears around death aren't going to actually kill you, you can actually have death become a friend, which is death is the thing that laser focuses your life on what you want to be spending your life on.
Yeah. Because
the worst thing that happens to humans is to be on your deathbed and realize I was never awake for any of this. You know, I was just kind of doing what I was expected to do. And I really would have done my life a lot differently. That pain is the pain that we can avoid by actually dying today and saying, okay, but I apparently am not dead yet. What do I want to do today? I want to tell the people around me that I love them. I want to have conversations like this just because I enjoy them, not because, they're going to be treasured forever and people are going to be listening to them thousands of years from now. No, probably not. But just because I'm enjoying the hell out of the conversation. So it becomes this friend where your death anxiety decreases because you've gotten closer to it. You've done some exposure therapy, and you've also allowed it then to change you, to have it be a friend that focuses your life and helps you to be more brave in your authentic life that you want to experience at the level of experience. And that's how death becomes a friend.
I love that so much. Again, I apologize because I keep bringing it back to the anecdotal, but one of the things I try to do on my channel is show the flaws, show my weaknesses, and then show things that have helped as well. The biggest, and I'm certain of this, the biggest change I had as a parent, and I think it's similar to what we're talking about here. I've read Meditations from Aurelius so many times, and I think there's actually better Stoic material out there now. But there's this part where he talks about every single night that he tucked his son into bed, his young son, he would imagine his son not waking up the next morning, and what that did to their time together, and as someone at that time who had two small kids, who was rushing through bedtimes, just wanted some quiet time, some alone time with the wife, like one of the few times in my life that something has been truly transformational from just reading a concept was slowing down and thinking about whether it's I or my wife or the kids. It could happen at any time, facing this. And then what that did, it just like the joy that went into bedtimes, no, I want to stay for 5 extra minutes until you tell me to go away because you're so tired, such a actual visceral change in my daily life. And it came from getting this laser focus of understanding the reality, not shying away from this. And that's what you're talking about, even with the Buddhist reminding 6 times a day. We need that perspective. I think a lot of people would think that's morbid or that's going to lead to these horrendous, depressive episodes. So again, I would just encourage from an anecdotal experience that for me, at least, it's exactly how you've talked about. And I don't do a perfect job with it. I don't remember this all the time. Not every night is nirvana, but it has been significant enough that I know it has helped practically in my daily life.
It's like you got to get closer to it and get over the hump because there's such benefits on the other side. And so what I'll do something similar where I'll wake up in the morning and I'll start my morning on my deathbed and I'll lay there and I'll imagine myself 90 years old. My brain's not working anymore. I'm not learning anymore. My body's not really working anymore. And I fully immerse myself into like, this is my last week or this is my last day. Like, because this day is coming. I really sit in it. And again, it can sound morbid if you haven't done things like this with death. But then the magical thing that happens is then I awake in my 39-year-old body. Like I'll do this sometimes when I wake up really grumpy. If I fully immerse myself in this kind of self-guided meditation where I'm on my deathbed, but I get to wake up and have another day in my 39-year-old body, I'll just be moved to tears. Yeah. And like all of a sudden my 6-year-old comes in and lays on my chest and I'm just crying because it's like, oh my gosh, I get to experience this one more time.
You would have killed for
and then
this
I wake
40
up and
years
I would have given any amount of money. I would have done anything. I would have chopped up my arm to just have this moment where your kid still wants to see you in the morning. And then I go make French toast because it's like, oh my gosh, I get to taste this again. And then the sun is shining on my skin and I get to feel warm for a second. It's like, I get to feel this. This is so good. And then I get to go take a hot shower. This is something that millions of humans never got to experience their entire life. It's this experience only for kings once in a while, maybe. And I just get to take a warm shower. And all of a sudden, I just move from this kind of grumpy morning of all the things that I want to do to just like weeping in nirvana at how beautiful it is to just be alive. But how I got there was laying on my deathbed and getting comfortable with the fact that this day is coming.
Wonderful. I love it so much. That's been actually my favorite so far that we've covered. And I think if anything can just change your actual daily perspective, it is doing some small practice of this. I mean, we've both found our own ways to essentially gain better perspective. And that is something that without being intentional about, it will just pass you by. And it's another 10 years later and you've been sad or depressed or anxious or worried or fearful. And some of that is out of our control to a chemical level, but there are things we can do to really benefit our daily life. And I love that. Number 7 is tradition.
Yeah, I'm curious what you're going to say about cultural Christianity. I feel like this is a place where I want to know what you think about this, because right now a conversation happening in atheist circles is how much of Christian culture do we want to keep? Because without it, the problem with Christianity kind of colonizing and taking over everything is for white people like me who I don't remember or have any history with what part of Europe I came from. I don't know what traditions my heritage did before Christianity. That's all been lost. So what is, for white people in America who have a history of Christianity, what is then your culture without Christianity? And it's like Christianity was kind of everything, and so we don't even remember or have any access to culture without it, or at least without intention, without creating that. Yeah. And so there's this conversation, and I think the one between Richard Dawkins and Ayaan Hirsi Ali is really where this conversation is being spearheaded, which is Richard Dawkins is saying loud and proud, I am a cultural Christian. I say grace at Christian colleges. I sing Christmas carols and not just the secular ones at Christmas time. I love the beautiful cathedrals. I want to keep all of this. I just don't want to have to believe in the supernatural. And then you have Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's really the 5th member of the atheist new movement, who's this ex-Muslim and very tough on Islam as a religion. And recently she converted to Christianity because she really saw the rise of political religions and the cult of the left and Islam. And she really saw nothing that secularism could do that could stand in the way of this. And so she jumps on board in her message about why she's Christian. She didn't talk about, I had this revelation and I talked to God and now I believe. It was almost like a practical decision that I think that losing Christianity is going to be bad for the world. And so she hops on board and she enjoys the fruit of Christianity. And she says she struggles with some of the truth claims, but she wants to get there. And so we're having now this debate, which is if we're not going to be Christian anymore, if we're going to throw all of this away, especially, because we're triggered by it, because we have a history in it, then what is our culture? Because now we're raising families without a family culture. And what we want is something like secular Judaism, which is the ability to not have to believe. There are atheist rabbis in New York City. This is a very common theme. You don't have to believe, but you still get the language and the art and the food and the culture and the community and the family, and you get all of the good stuff. But that's not happening in Christianity right now in America, because you're either fully on board in Christianity and on the Trump train and conservatism and all of that, or what? Nothing, or you're building your family culture from scratch. And this is actually something that's hard. Like, I'm a mother of 4 children. I have taken them out of religion, and I live in I live in Idaho. It's very Mormon. It's very Christian. And now I'm essentially in charge of creating a family culture from scratch. That takes effort and privilege and education and intention. And it can be very difficult to replace, which is why now atheists are starting to talk about, wait a second, guys, do we need to be holding on to cultural Christianity because we don't have culture without it?
Yeah. It's
what do you think?
I think it's a huge problem. I don't want to deny the problem. Am I the kind of atheist that won't sing Holy Night? Of course not. I will absolutely sit there, hold hands, and sing Holy Night and enjoy it. However, do I think I need to sing Holy Night to appreciate Christmas time and family time? And do I think there's a better song that could be sung? Absolutely. Other than your point, which I think is a really good point. And again, people are going to hear the word privilege and be turned off to some degree, but you're 100% right that if we have the ability, like, I love the traditions I'm creating with my kids. I read a story from Greek mythology every night with my son instead of a Bible story, because I'm not attaching all these truth claims, and we can talk about how the God was bad and good. And it's fine. And you can still learn from it. And it's still this great archetypical story. But that's a position of privilege to be able to have the free time with the kids and the resources and the knowledge to be able to do this. I completely understand that. And so for people that aren't as lucky in this position, the culture is going to exist somewhere. Long story short, I actually don't think that this whole Judeo-Christian values thing is Judeo-Christian. I think it's Western European from the last few hundred years that just happened to be a place where a lot of people believed in this particular God. But I don't see where the beliefs, as the Bible lays them out, came into the sciences, came into the culture. We don't practice anything really, I think, on a cultural level that is spelled out in the Bible, whether it's Old Testament or even some of Jesus's better teachings in the New Testament. So it just seems to be like this background thing that we kept hanging our coat on. And so that's like the consistent common denominator. But I think that we do have a culture of kind of Western European, and it was from Enlightenment, and it was from philosophical debate and conversation, and it was from the emphasis on the scientific process. And a lot of those early people happen to be believers. So that's how I've differentiated it in my mind. I could be completely off. I'm sure it needs more examination. But ultimately, because of the negative connotation, and I think it can do more harm than good. I think when Richard came out, and he's been saying it for 20 years, but I know the interview you're talking about recently, like 6 months ago when he said it, and the online Christian world erupts. Richard Dawkins is coming back to Christianity, and it can diminish the overall message of what he's been trying to say for the last 2 decades. And so I would prefer, kind of like we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, to find a better term than cultural Christianity.
That's interesting. So how I'm reacting to what you said is that there are some things that are more easily replaceable than others. So for example, all bridges used to be made by people who believed in God. But now, it's very easy for us to say, well, that was just because everybody was religious during that time. That has nothing really to do with Christianity. We can build bridges just fine as secular people. That's an easy transition. But some things I think have a better argument. So for example, songs. If I wanted to, during Christmas, to be able to sing songs with other humans, which actually is really good for our brains. It can get us to these transcendent states where we really start to feel a oneness. It's really good for us to sing to each other. If I wanted to sing, it'd be so easy to go to any corner where I live and find people to sing with. Now, getting atheists together to sing, we go to concerts for that, but that's not usually something that we can pass down to our kids. It's a little bit harder to replace. In fact, some musical people will sometimes mourn leaving church because they don't have as much opportunity to sing with people as they used to. And my fear is that the things that are hard for secularism to replace are valuable. So for example, let's say for Christmas and Easter, your family for generations have always celebrated Christmas and Easter. Let's say you don't believe anymore. You either have to kind of come up with your own kind of random holidays as part of your own family liturgical calendar, and you have to do that from scratch when religion has had thousands of years to develop these liturgical calendars for heroes and stories and holidays, or you adjust them. And what I see happen is atheists will say, well, I don't believe anymore. And so Christmas then becomes about presents and Easter becomes about candy. So we've taken the transcendent, even though it's wrong, we've taken the transcendent and we've replaced it with materialism. We've replaced it with consumerism. It fills a vacuum when we've lost the transcendent. And so I do think that there's almost something more damaging for kids to just be getting presents and candy. I'd almost rather than get some Christianity, because then they at least get some sense of the transcendent or some stories about Jesus being a good person, or that good, amazing people can be born in barns. There's some stories there that are at least compelling and interesting. But if we only replace it with presents and candy, that's the problem that I'm seeing.
No, I agree. I think it needs to be done well. I think a good, and you're right. There's something about the US that is losing this. Because I heard this example the other day. You can go to Europe right now, and just like you were talking about going to any corner and being able to sing at Christmas time, you can go into any pub in a multitude of countries over there, and you can join in and sing drinking songs or cheer for your team. And again, I would say not just concerts,
watch a soccer game and sing the soccer game.
You can have the camaraderie. You can have that unity. You can have what I would assume is equal on a brain level to getting together on Christmas Eve and singing that song. We just don't have that here either. But that has nothing to do with religion. That's community. And so when I think about yes, there's a void that religion will leave, we need to fill, I see it more as a current cultural problem of the US that we haven't already developed these things. And I think some of the reason Europe might have these things is because they let go of their fundamentalism a lot longer ago, and they've started developing some of these things. And so I just go back to, we might need that infancy and those growing pains before we're going to get it right. But I completely agree. Your example about Easter and Christmas and losing the transcendent, and just because I was going to give you that example, I was going to say, well, for Easter, we still do the egg hunt, and it's not about Jesus, but you're right. It does become a little more materialistic. So that's something to think about for sure.
Yeah. So for Europe, they have been doing this longer. God died in the wars of the 20th century for them. So they have been doing this longer, and so they have developed other cultural things. Certainly, soccer is one of them, and they have other things, but there's also problems that they're dealing with that are on our horizon now too. So they're talking about the rise of Islam. They're talking about political, a rise in nationalism, which is also something that happens, and leaving Brexit and seeing these rise in these kind of Trump-like demagogue, political God kind of characters. And so that stuff is coming for us too. The nihilism, the rise in fundamentalism, and the rise in political nationalism. And so they've been dealing with that longer, and it doesn't look great. They're struggling with those aspects. And so we need to understand that that's on our horizon too, even though they've also developed some other things to be able to combat this need for meaning and community and tradition.
No, you're right. It's hard. But when I think about what Ayan did, and I'm not basing this off anything, I'm giving you my personal opinion, I think that can't be the answer. I think that does so much more harm than good for promoting it. I would definitely prefer a Dawkins approach over Ayan's approach. But that's why I think what you're doing, what I want to be doing is so needed, because otherwise, there's a trajectory that's pretty clear, but I wouldn't want that to cause me to hit reverse either.
Yeah, it's not causing me to hit reverse, although I will say that I don't have a lot of faith that I'm on the winning side of this battle between religion and secularism.
Yeah.
I mean, it took me a degree in philosophy and theology and 20 years to be able to wrestle out in my own brain. That's not a privilege that most people have. And it's tough to require that of people.
For sure. But 20 years of trying to get out of it is a privileged position that not everyone has, but it was only necessary because we were born into the religion in the first place.
Yeah, I want to push back on this one, because I think one of the subtle lies of atheism is that we're all born atheists. And while that's true in the sense of we're conditioned into these religions and we're conditioned into these beliefs in God, I think a better way to say it is that we are born superstitious. And so you do have to educate that out. And that then is a privilege. So if you put 100 babies on an island and they're able to grow up, they are going to create religion. They're going to actually create gods. They're going to create the supernatural. We know this, unless you have other education otherwise. And so it's this situation like sugar, like our bodies are made in order to, when we get a little taste of sugar, our body thinks, oh, this fruit is only going to be ripe enough right now. I want you to eat all the sugar. And we actually have to educate ourselves and say, I understand why I have this impulse. It feels natural to me to just binge all this sugar, but actually there's sugar around me all the time and I actually don't need to eat this and it's going to be okay. We have to educate ourselves and override something that's very instinctual. And I think from what we know about our brains and the origins of religion and how we are naturally superstitious and we assign agency to external agents unless we have education to otherwise, even if we're not going to be born into a religion, we are born superstitious. And that's going to be a recurring problem. That makes it then harder than I think what you're describing.
No, I think we're agreeing a lot more than it seems. I couldn't agree with you more that we're all born superstitious and that if left to our own natural devices, we would return to different religions, but religion nonetheless. But I do think that that's what we get to do in our privilege, is be able to train up the next generation and as many people as possible what the override procedures look like.
I think why I get scared in this question, or I lose my confidence that we're able to do this, was just watching how quickly we left religion and we just jumped into manifesting new age spiritual bullshit. And we were just doing the same things. We were avoiding God. We were predicting the future so that we could deal with our anxiety. We were doing all the same things that we were doing in religion, but it's not religion because, I'm a witch or whatever it is.
Sure.
And the speed and the sheer number of people who didn't fully deconstruct and have access to these tools to actually educate themselves out of their superstitious impulses. Our inability to do that when we had the opportunity to, when we were leaving religion and we just kind of jumped onto the new age thing, gives me pause that we're going to be able to do this well.
No, we agree on so much. It's just the framing, and mine is more of a naivety. I see that middle ground of all the stupid superstitious stuff we fell into as the necessary step. or if let's go this way instead, the necessary step up and out. But it could be just we're always going to do this, and that's what we got instead, and it's not any better. So I'm with you, but I think we should move on to the next one.
Okay, so community, we've already kind of done a lot of the groundwork of this, so I'm not gonna repeat myself on the conversation we had around community. The only thing I just want to add is the cost that Gen Alpha and Gen Z is paying as their millennial and Gen X parents leave religion. Maybe the best that they could do was just deal with their own religious trauma and just be the person to take the step out. It may be too much to ask for a lifetime to ask you to not only step outside of religion, but also create a whole new thing, right? That's a lot of work. Really, we're seeing Gen Alpha and Gen Z struggle, not just because of phones and smartphones and all the things that they're dealing with, but also that as a generation, they didn't get a nest period that every other generation in human history got, which is that you have belonging and ritual and moral education and people from the tribe teaching you an identity and structure and rites of passage when you hit certain ages. There's a nest period that needs to happen that religions do really well at. Religions had a long time to be able to develop tools for that as a community. And so for Gen X and millennial parents like me leaving, it can leave this gap, and Gen X kids really struggle with identity and sometimes take longer because they just didn't get a good nest period.
It's my biggest fear. Aside of everything else we said, I'm a parent first. It is sensitive to me because I see some of the benefit my kids still get from Christian community. And I know that we don't have that solved. And again, I'm still lost for words. I know what I'm doing anecdotally. I know what I'm doing individually with them. When my son turned 7, he got a knife and we went on a big hiking trip. And it was this big rite of passage. You've trained for this since you were 5. We're going to climb this mountain. You're going to get to the top. We're going to use your knife to do this with the flint, make your first fire. It was a thing that I got to help him create. And it's in addition to everything else he's getting. It was fantastic. Like that's great. That could be a replacement, but not en masse and not anytime soon. And so I'm very worried in general. I share that.
Yeah, it's really hard. And I'm able to participate less in Mormonism just because they kind of have a hard line as far as belief. They don't have it's a young religion, so they don't have a lot of room for nuance. So my kids aren't getting any of that, which means I had to intentionally create that. And it does take a lot of work. So with my son, it was getting him involved in karate because these are men that were teaching him Bruce Lee and they were teaching him all these values. And I just had to say, okay, like we are really invested in this community, in this karate community. And for my daughter, it was a little bit more Girl Scouts. And then my 2 youngest, I kind of haven't figured out how to develop community for them yet. They're young. And so for 4 kids to have to find and pay for and making time investments for them to be developing with other children, with other adult mentors, it takes a lot of effort in the secular world. Whereas at church, you literally just walk in through the door and it's already set up for you. Yeah. Gen Z is paying the price for those growing pains as we are trying to figure that out in the secular world.
No, it's a huge deal. I'm really glad you're bringing attention to it in this video and in the way that you have. It's sad to think of it as an experiment because these are people and these are lives and it's an entire generation or 2 or 3 or who knows how long it goes on before or if we get it figured out or we revert to the only thing that ever got us any semblance of it. But it's one of the greatest experiments that I can imagine after all of our evolutionary history to be on this precipice where really for the first time, there isn't that tribalism, that religious culture.
Without a myth.
Yeah.
We've never done society without a collective myth.
Yeah.
We don't know if we're going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
We have to try. What are we going to do? Go back to Zeus? Like we have to try.
Well, that was exactly my point earlier. Like without being able to hit the reverse button, I'm at a loss of, I know that's not the answer, but it doesn't mean we've solved the other side. So
correct.
Number 9
so
was
the
one
next
of the
one you wanted. Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the most interesting to me because it's one I hadn't thought about. I think I had considered almost everything else on the list. Let me see. There was one other one that really was unique to me. Some of the things you said about isolation were things I'd never considered, but this one you framed as discussion with yourself or the conversation with yourself, and you brought in prayer. I would love for you to explain it more thoroughly, though.
Sure. So one thing that religion and spiritual places will do is give you tools for a conversation between your conscious and subconscious mind. And that is very helpful. We need that. Obviously, as a secular person, I'm looking at prayer as you're only talking to yourself. That's the paradigm that I'm operating under. And so people will just say, oh, if you're just talking to yourself, then what's the point of prayer? Actually, it's still doing a lot of things. So if you are praying for a specific child, for example, that is priming your brain to notice and to pay attention to times when you can reach out to that child. That actually shows up positively in the world. Even if that prayer is not like leaving the roof, right? Even if that prayer doesn't do anything except prime your brain. Another one is just having that conversation. In prayer, you can feel like you're maybe having a conversation with God. And it's really just a ritual that helps you have a conversation with yourself, with other parts of your psyche and your highest self and whatever that is. And so when you take prayer away, or you take some of these tools away, even something like tarot can do this, but usually people have to believe that it's true in order for them to get the tool for it. Whatever it is, you need tools to be able to have conversations with your subconscious mind. Now, they'll just call it prayer and that you're talking to God. That's the vessel that's helping you to get access to this tool. And so sometimes upon leaving religion, you can feel that you lose access to a part of yourself because you've lost any kind of superstition. And so then how do I actually reach that part of myself? What do I do when I want to make a decision and I want to tap into my own intuitive wisdom? I used to have prayer for that, or I used to believe in astrology and now I don't, or I used to believe that, the world's spun in such a way that I could only get this tarot card today. And that gave me, an ability to do this. And if you lose all that, people can feel like I now don't have tools to access all of my subconscious mind and what it's doing. Now, there are better tools, I would argue. You do one, which is mythology and Jungian archetypes, which is a great way to use symbolism and story to draw out different parts of our psyche to understand ourselves. And there's lots of other ways, but upon leaving religion, you can feel like I've lost a connection to myself because I don't have any of these tools anymore because I can't use them.
It's huge. And again, it was the one that caught my attention the most in watching your video the first time, because I noticed how true it was. As someone who's made like 3 very big videos on the problems with prayer, and though I've admitted certain things that are happening there, you brought the data points to me about what is actually still going on and beneficial that I found really, really fascinating and worrisome about then what we are losing. Would things like journaling and meditation be of the same mind?
Yeah. So journaling, meditation, guided meditations, symbolism, archetypes. I would even say dream work, which can sound woo, but I don't think is very woo.
You mean
it's
like lucid dreaming, or what do you mean by dream work?
You can do lucid dreaming, but I just mean waking up and writing down your dream. And you could even plug it in. People are doing this on ChatGPT. They'll put in their dream and a little bit about their life, and they'll ask ChatGPT to do a Jungian analysis on it, like an archetypal analysis. Yeah. And people will find like, oh yeah, it brought something forth that I wasn't paying attention to. So this happened to me recently. I had a dream. I'm just going to be vulnerable and honest here, where I had pooped my pants. Okay. Everybody poops their pants once in a while, I guess. I don't know. I was hiding that I had pooped my pants. I was hiding it from my husband, and I could tell this in the dream. Wrote in kind of all the details of my dream and a little bit about my relationship and stuff that's going on in my relationship. And I realized by working with this dream that there was some shadow parts of me that I was hiding from my husband because I wanted some focus over here on some good things that I was doing, and it wasn't leading to true intimacy because I was hiding some stuff. Now, my conscious mind, completely unaware that I was doing this.
Sure.
So me actually working with this dream brought up some insight that actually helped my life and my relationships. But there's lots of things that you can do, and I do lots of these things. There is something about the regularity of prayer though that can be helpful, because I just kind of do it when I feel like it, whereas there's something beneficial about continually checking in with yourself.
Yeah.
And people who are very close, like have a very solid understanding of themselves, they often have something at least weekly or daily, a way to check in, whether that's meditating or their nightly journal. There are things that you can do where you can just ask a question and see what pops up from your subconscious mind, what pops up into your conscious mind. But it's just not going to be as regular as when you believe you need to pray every day, or you need to meditate every day, or you need to do this every day. So there is something I think lost in that you have to then be your own engine for, so that you can keep that deep conversation with yourself going.
Yeah, I just never considered it under that framing. I mean, I've been a lifelong journaler. I did a video on it recently. I've been journaling for 2 decades straight, almost daily. And I feel like it's given me,
that's great.
It's given me that. It's the closest thing I would see to it, because it is an ongoing internal conversation. And I think you'd probably agree, whether it's dream work, journaling, meditation, whatever it is, they might be distinctions without differences, because it's just a mode of getting in somehow to other, what just happens organically if we aren't intentional with these things. I think a lot of people shy away from this kind of thing because they might actually think it's another form of woo. And so people that are really trying to be like hard, rational, whatever, they might see this as, what I would encourage people is, it's not like there's some entity inside you that knows something kind of, but it's not like you're checking into the spiritual at all. This is as natural and as real as it gets, that our mind works in these layers. And to access them, you have to do more work sometimes.
I think this is where rational people will struggle sometimes, because rational people can feel like, I'm a rational being and I make decisions based on truth and rationality, when really the rational part of our brains, this is just basic neuroscience. The rational part of our brains is such a small sliver of our attention. And we have this hierarchy of values, and we have subconscious fears and subconscious desires. We have this whole ocean of things going on underneath the surface of our attention. We get 20 million bits of information per second. We can attend to about 20 bits of information per second. Yeah. But our subconscious is holding on to a lot.
Sure.
Like a lot more. And so for rational people just to be like, I don't need any of that woo bullshit. It's like, okay, live your life on your tiny little sliver of attention based on what you think is rational, not knowing why you even lean towards rationality or why that's a core value. That's probably a wound that you need to look at, because often rational people go there for safety because of a wound. And so I think this is sometimes where, rational people can get caught, because they'll identify so strongly with that just rational part of your brain, but you are far more emotional.
Yeah. A book that really helped me with that, just a recommendation. And actually, I'm going to ask you, as we move towards the end here, working towards the ideal, you're so well read and studied. I'd be curious what has influenced you. But have you read much Jonathan Haidt?
I listen to podcasts on the books.
Oh, okay. Got it.
I don't think I've read ever the full thing, but I do listen to a lot of him podcasts.
His book, I thought, is kind of similar in nature to your overall goal. He has a book called The Happiness Hypothesis. The Righteous Mind really helped me understand where people are still coming from a religious angle, and give me much more empathy. But the happiness hypothesis was kind of taking all of the wisdom traditions from the past and historical religion and bringing that into the neuroscience. And he talks about an elephant and rider, is the analogy that he comes up with, one being the limbic system and one being the prefrontal cortex, and the struggle there, and how much more that elephant is in control than the rider. And when we try to use that rationality to control the elephant, no, this is a battle you will not win, but can you learn how to nudge and direct it better? And it does a phenomenal job of helping you visualize what might be happening in the brain, so you don't lose that importance of the elephant when trying to become the rider you want to be. And so it works on many levels.
And what I like about that analogy is, if religion developed tools to help the rider and elephant interact, even if it wasn't supernatural, even if it just developed a tool for that, then if you leave all those tools and just call it all woo, okay, well, now you're just a rider on a wild elephant.
Yes, so good.
And you have nothing to help that relationship. There's such an aversion to it. But there's no reason to. There's no even rational reason to. Like, our brain is far more wild elephant than it is rider.
Yes. No, so good. I couldn't agree more. So let's move into the finality of the conversation. And again, this has been wonderful. But I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts. Anything you'd want to end with here on this final point?
Yeah. So my last point was the benefit that comes by working with an ideal, even if that ideal is not real. And the example that I give is my doctorate professor. His name is Thomas Ord, who's just one of the most beautiful people that I've ever met. In each moment, he truly asks himself, how do I meet this moment with the most love possible? And that is how he lives his life. Just one of the most beautiful human beings. Now, he believes truly, he believes in a God of love. He believes that God is love. And by working with that ideal every day for his life, I can tell that even though I don't believe his God is real, and it's difficult for me to understand how he deals with the problem of evil, it's not something that I could get on board with. Even so, I have to admit that him working with a God of love, even if that God wasn't real, made him a fantastic person. I have seen few people become that loving without that kind of daily interaction with the ideal of love. Now, for some people, they're able to do that. Love is my God, and maybe they have practices and contemplative practices and reminders to help them, really act from a place of love. But that's going to require a lot more intention than if you just believed that the God of love is real and interacting with that. And so I have to admit, even though I don't believe in his God, his belief in that God made him an incredibly loving human being in a way that not believing in that God probably would not have. Like, this guy is just next level loving and compassionate. I just have to, even as an atheist, I have to validate that there are times where working with whatever you're calling perfection, and you're working with that concept in prayer, you're trying to get closer to it. You have an atonement when you make mistakes so that you can get back to that relationship of working with it. There can be a tool there that is helping people to grow and progress that I just have to admit could be there even if their God isn't real. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and I'd agree. And it just sucks because pretty much what our conversation sums up to is that there are these things religion has provided for when they go well. Like you said, he's not dealing with the truth of it or the issues that can also come with it. He's held on to the one good part of it, love, that we could all probably agree is a good thing. And I wish we could just create a new religion, still with some myth, still with some concept of a God that was just better. Like, I'm not against religion. Let's just get a better prototype.
The funny thing is, like, people will say, like, why don't we just create myth, create gods, create a pantheon and work with these gods, but we'll know that we made this up. And then we actually try that sometimes, and then we end up getting sucked into it and believing that it's real.
Oh, that's funny.
Even when we know that we made it up. Like, there are people who have tried to do this. I follow all of these churches that are trying different things, different modern things.
Yeah.
I follow a lot of that as part of my work. And so when there have been some people who have tried to create religion like that, but by knowing that it's mythology, hopefully you cut down on the dogmatism, and eventually it just takes over anyway.
That doesn't surprise me.
Even look at Jesus, even look at what we did with Jesus and Buddha. Like, the empires that we've built in the name of Buddha and Jesus are so opposite from what they would have wanted in their own text. And it doesn't matter. We just as humans tend to do that. And so I wish we could do that, but we just get too sucked into it.
Yeah.
We're too culty by nature.
We are. But the one thing that I think is similar, and I think you even have a video on this or similar, coming up with a core value. And this is, what I try to, if I am preaching on, if someone's asking me like, well, now what? I think that after you do a lot of the work to heal wounds and address trauma and things like that, you need to start developing a personal philosophy. And the cool thing about not having a God at the center of it is that you can steal and borrow and take these things that have worked. And I've curated and am curating. This conversation alone has poked a hole in a few things that I've thought that will go back to the drawing board and curate and continue to create this identity or core value system. There's a lot of different ones. You mentioned earlier your example of we're working out of truth and your husband working out of loyalty. And I'm sure there's some like actual core pillars that are out there of how people orient their life. And I'd like to think that mine is truth, but I'd also include in there, things like empathy and love. And you create a philosophy or a core value system or a hierarchy of values that help influence how you handle everyday situations and conversations and other people and loss and things like this. And that's just the best that I can do. And that's what I try to encourage others who are in my same spot without that. So it just takes work, and intention is, again, a common theme I think we've arrived at here, that without the structure of religion, you've got to work and you've got to be ready to, and you've got to have the intention.
Yeah. And this is really Nietzsche's conclusion too, which is it is possible. He had this concept of an Übermensch, or something like overman or more than a man or Superman, where you have to live according to your own values. You have to discover your core values, and you have to really build your life according to these core values and live an authentic life, sometimes pushing up against the mores of society in order to live a life that is fundamentally worth living for you. Now, he saw that this was possible for individuals, but when he saw how hard it was, that religions have had thousands of years to develop shortcuts for all of these things that we need, to ask an individual to recreate that in one lifetime by themselves, he realized was an incredibly hard ask, and that most people wouldn't be able to do it, but that it was possible. So if truth seeking is a core value, and so you're going to do this anyway, then, this path is a hard path, but it's the one that you chose because truth is a high core value for you. And so it's not as easy. This is why I talk about it. It's not as easy as atheists saying, just leave religion. It's so stupid and superstitious.
Yes.
And that sometimes really is the narrative. And as we've outlined, there are things that we feel like we're doing well individually or as parents, and we also recognize, hey, there's some holes here, and we need to be more honest about that so that we can further develop the landing platform for people leaving religion. Otherwise, we're just going to create worse religions in our politics, because political religions are everything that is bad about religions, with no Jesus, with no transcendent, with no you're ever wrong. Like it doesn't get any of that. And so I want to talk about the challenges more openly, even though you and I are still going to continue to be atheists even after discussing this list, and we're still going to do different things with our children, and there's no going back. We have to recognize where things are difficult because religion co-evolved with us, and we're trying to do this now without that nest, and that's difficult for the reasons that we talked about.
Yeah, no, this has been thoroughly interesting to me, but also necessary. A lot of my conversations with other non-believers, of course, continue to revolve around why the Bible's not true, and this issue and this contradiction and this philosophical problem, which is great. I think it's important. I think that it helps people deconstruct.
Fun.
And it's fun.
Yeah, it's good. It's so fun.
It's
so fun to be right.
Well, the thing is, it's funny because as we've established today, it's only half right. Being able to say something's not true is not being right about what is true. And that sucks to realize.
The analogy I use, which I know you're going to love, is we don't know how many blades of grass are on the earth. And maybe as humans, we never develop that kind of technology and we'll never know. But we can know that it's not two.
Sure.
And
yes.
and
which doesn't
you know what I
give
mean?
us much information.
It doesn't give us much. And so sometimes atheists, we're focusing on the fact of why we know that it's not two.
Both sides. Knowing that it's not two, if everyone orients their life around it being two, and the fact that it's two actually produces a mass amount of harm, then it's good to know it's not two. And I know you agree with that.
Yeah.
But you are right.
Yeah.
There is a landscape out there past that is probably more important. It's interesting. It's like, actually, the most important thing, if you're on this path, if you're on the path of deconstruction, truth, deconversion, leaving a harmful religion, is to first get there, right? To know that, to actually rid yourself of that false belief system. Very important. But then everything after that is going to equal the weight of what your life actually is from there. And that's why I was so excited to talk to you and so excited for what I'm seeing you do, because I think the biggest part comes afterwards, which is developing a good life, living a good life. How do you live well? So yeah, I want to end by saying thank you for what you do and what you offer, your courses, your book. I'll have all of it linked down below. I'd love to hear any recommendations you have about just practical steps people can take, whether it's a book to read or other than your own work, someone to check out or something to listen to, or what you have found most helpful. I'd love to just get some recommendations from you for the audience.
My last thought is the best thing I think that atheists can do to combat religion is offer something better. And that is where we need to have more conversations like this, where, hey, how are you parenting? What are the tools that you have found that helped you build your own meaning of life and purpose of life and the good life? And more conversations and more tools and more resources for that. Why would people then choose to be in a building where their child's going to be, sexually assaulted, or all the issues that people are dealing with in religion, if there was truly something better on offer?
Yeah.
So rather than getting bogged down sometimes in the conversation, even though I will always get bogged down in those conversations, I'll do it anyway. A lot of times I feel like like I actually have more success with people, showing here's some solid science here on human well-being, and that spirituality is a part of it. Here's a way to do it that doesn't give you so much cognitive dissonance, where you have to say, well, God is mysterious, or that doesn't make sense to me, but I have faith. You actually don't have to do that, because here you can still get all the same tools that you were getting from religion, but you can do it in a way where you don't have to have that internal struggle. I think people are more willing to listen to that than to say you're in a cult and things that are just going to force them to double down on their identity because you're pushing on things that are sacred to them. So this is why I loved this conversation so much, and I just think it's so needed in especially atheistic, post-religious, post-deconstruction spaces. So where you can find me is I'm No Nonsense Spirituality. I spend a lot of time on TikTok. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel to help that get going. I just started. I have a book, No Nonsense Spirituality, and on my website I also have a lot of coaching and courses options. So I have a course on nihilism and religious deconstruction. Lots of courses on there. I just did one on death and mortality because I had so many clients that were dealing with the same issues with death. And so I put all my tools into that. So I made a death course over the summer. So lots of resources for wherever you are on this deconstruction, reconstruction path. And then, as far as books on this conversation, I really like the book Wild Mercy, which is tender wisdom from female mystics, which really helped me to see how much after deconstruction, how much my spirituality was still being limited by the fact that men define what religion and spirituality is, and it often looks different for women. That was really helpful for me. I liked Strange Rites, 7 New Religions, and it talks about how in America, like if you're interested in the conversation of America, how America is leaving organized religion, but the 7 religions in America that took its place.
Okay.
So like
check that
wellness culture. There's a bunch of kind of new religions that are acting like religions in America that is really interesting. I liked Sasha Sagan. She did a book on the science of rituals. This is the daughter of Carl Sagan, who was dealing with how do I raise my kids in secularism, and that was really helpful for me as a parent because she's the daughter of Carl Sagan, but she's looking at the science of rituals and how do I develop this for my
incredible.
family.
I didn't even know this existed. I'm going to get that tomorrow. That's amazing.
That's a great book, and she sometimes podcasts on it too. You should invite her on your channel.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't think of any.
No, that's fine. I put you on the spot. I should have given you this ahead of time.
There's a couple. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's
There's a couple
great.
that I've been liking lately.
And again, I'll continue to endorse you. I don't take it lightly. I have a spot in every description of my video where I list resources because for all the things that I say, go and get actual help, get counseling, get integrated work, learn from people that are actually living this out. And so I'll include you in that because I've been really impressed with your work and I thank you for it. And I thank you for the discussion.
Yeah, this has been so great. And I appreciate when we're able to get into these atheist spaces where we know that we're not going to be pushing woo on each other. So we don't have to defend atheism so hard, because sometimes I feel like religious people pretend to be happier than they are to support their religion. And sometimes atheists can do that too.
Yes.
So I appreciated that we were able to have some vulnerability in this conversation, that there are some things that are hard, or there are some things as parents that, we stay up at night thinking about. And just that vulnerability piece is really important and not often a part of these atheist versus religion kinds of conversations. So I appreciate your vulnerability.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, I'm sure we'll meet again. I would love to. So until then.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.